In this section, we'll look at how the war went from June 1944, D-Day, until the end of 1944, about the time of the Battle of the Bulge. Now, the invasion of Western France, known as D-Day, was called Operation Overlord, and everybody knew it was coming. The question was where and when. The Germans assumed that the most likely scenario was that the Allies invaded Calais, which is the narrowest part of the English Channel. But Rommel, who was in charge of the German defenses, had built up massive fortifications, bunkers, and tank blocks and mines all along the western coast of France. The invasion took place on the Normandy Peninsula on June 6, 1944. First in were the paratroopers and gliders, and also the French resistance began to rise up. Rommel figured attack wasn't coming because there was terrible stormy weather, and Rommel was even in Berlin with the cold because he was so sure that an attack wouldn't come. The attack in Normandy was the largest amphibious assault in human history. On that day, over 200,000 Canadians, Americans, British, Australian, and other troops landed on 5 beachheads on the Normandy Peninsula: Gold, Juneau, Sword, Utah, and Omaha. Most of them went okay, but Omaha, which the Americans, where some of the most Americans landed, that was undoubtedly the harshest. Perhaps you've seen Saving Private Ryan. By the end of the month, approximately 1 million troops had come ashore. Rommel insisted that the Americans must be stopped on the beaches. If the Allies got a foothold, he assumed a two-front war meant that Germany would ultimately lose the war. When the initial attack began at Normandy, Rommel wanted Hitler to pull up his reserve elite panzer tank divisions, but Hitler feared that the attack on Normandy was just a diversion, and so he delayed, and that was going to prove a critical mistake. Much to Rommel's dismay, the Allies had a beachhead within the first couple of days, and they were pouring in men and resources. There was a real problem taking the city of Caen. The British were supposed to take it on the first day, but it actually took several weeks. Moreover, moving out of the Normandy Peninsula was very difficult because the country was separated by hedgerows and these fields, and you really couldn't see on the other side of a hedgerow, and so you had many very close combat type situations, and it was very deadly. After weeks of bloody hedgerow fighting in Normandy, the American Third Army finally broke out under General George S. Patton, who was famously known as Blood and Guts Patton, and he was so tough that he was known for slapping one of his own soldiers. The Third Army, having broken out of the hedgerows, raced eastward, cutting across France as 1944 progressed. As Patton's Third Army raced across France, the Americans and the Free French also launched an invasion from the Mediterranean into the south of France, into Vichy, France. The idea was that they would tie up with the Allies from Normandy. Obviously, this invasion was a lot less deadly than the Normandy invasion had been. It was known as Operation Dragoon. Just as Operation Dragoon was invading in the south of France, Patton's army had swept across the eastward of France, and in August, the French capital of Paris finally was liberated. Charles de Gaulle, who had been the Free French leader in England for the past 3 or 4 years, paraded to thousands in the cheering crowd. In any event, the Germans surrendered before Paris suffered heavy bombing or casualties, a fact that some attribute to the humanism of the German commander. By November 1944, the Allies had liberated Holland and Belgium and appeared ready to invade Germany itself. In the east, the Soviets continued to push westward and were preparing to enter Germany as well. It was exactly the two-front war that Germany had feared since World War I. As the Soviets pushed westward, the full extent of what we now know as the Holocaust was beginning to become apparent with the liberation of concentration camps in Eastern Europe. For much of the war, the West knew that the Nazis were rounding up Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and and others who they deemed undesirable in camps. Most, however, didn't really realize the full extent of the Nazi effort. Today we know that in early 1942, in a secret conference, it was decided to launch what the Nazis termed, quote, the final solution to the Jewish problem of Europe, unquote. No longer would they simply round up Jews for work camps where they might work them to death, but rather it was actual factory-like death camps, systematically murdering thousands regularly, routinely, and continually. It was the final solution for Hitler. One of the most famous, or I should say infamous, of the extermination camps was Auschwitz in southern Poland. At the gate of the camp, the sign read, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. It's difficult to determine the exact number of people killed at Auschwitz, but estimates range from 900,000 to 1.4 million. By the end of 1944, there were 17 major concentration camps. The estimates of the total number of people killed are anywhere between 6 and 11 million people. Jews would be rounded up and put in cattle cars on trains to the camp. Once there, they were divided between those who might work and those who appeared too old, too young, weak, or sick, or whatever to work. The latter were told that they were being deloused and forced into so-called showers, where Zyklon B and other poisons would come from the shower heads. The staff would stack up the bodies, extract any gold or metal from the teeth, and burn the corpse. This process went on continuously, non-stop. Throughout the Holocaust, Nazi doctors also did these horrible experiments on living prisoners. The camps were staffed by the Nazi elite, the SS, who were the true believers. Keep in mind that not all Germans were Nazis, and among all Nazis, not all were SS. But in the concentration camp, the SS were the ones who pulled out the war's worst atrocities. When the war was ending, there was a debate about how much the German civilians knew of the final solution. What did they really know of the concentration camps? Now, undoubtedly, they knew that the Jews are being rounded up, but did they know that it was a factory-like systemic murder? When the Americans liberated the camp at Buchenwald in April 1945, they made the nearby citizens march through the camp and its dead bodies, and of course all the citizens were aghast with handkerchiefs held over their mouths to block the stench of the rotting corpse. The realization of the extent of the Holocaust gave momentum after the war to the creation of a Jewish homeland in the former British Mandate of Palestine. When the modern state of Israel was formed in 1948, the neighboring Arab nations objected, and a war broke out. The Middle East, of course, today remains a contentious area ever since. Realizing that the war was lost, leading German military figures began to plan an assassination attempt, a coup that Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg ultimately carried out with a time bomb in a suitcase that he brought to a briefing room at Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters, known as the Wolf's Lair. When Stauffenberg left the room, he left the briefcase, which exploded. Stauffenberg was convinced that all in the room were dead, but in reality, only 4 died and the rest were injured. Hitler was injured, but saved by the heavy, solid oak conference table that blocked the blast from him. Stauffenberg had already left for Berlin to help guide a coup in the wake of Hitler's death, but when it was learned that Hitler had survived, the coup fell apart. After a brief period, Stauffenberg was captured and executed. In the end, a show trial by Nazi judges condemned more than 200 people to death. By the November 1944 election, Roosevelt was obviously ill, but decided to run for an unprecedented 4th term. Anticipating that he might not live through another 4 years, a big fight began among Democrats over who'd be nominated as FDR's vice presidential running mate. The sitting vice president, Henry Wallace, had made too many enemies, and the party was divided between its more conservative southern elements and its more liberal northerners. In a compromise, FDR and the convention settled on a relative unknown, acceptable to all sides, Missouri Senator Harry S. Truman. In the general election, the Republicans nominated the governor of New York, Thomas Dewey. Dewey was rather colorless and bland and had trouble criticizing the president because the president was leading a nation at war, and criticizing him could seem unpatriotic. In the end, FDR won a solid victory, winning over 25 million votes to Dewey's 22 million. Weeks after the 1944 election, with the Americans prepared to enter Germany from the west and the Soviets in the east, few people thought the Germans would launch an offensive, or even have the capacity to do so. Surprisingly, however, in that December cold on the Western Front, the Germans attacked through the Ardennes forest and hoped to drive northwest to recapture the Dutch port of Rotterdam. This would separate the Allied troops surrounding those in the north. After some initial success, which created a bulge in the German lines, and this helped make the battle known as the Battle of the Bulge, the German advance stalled. They had, however, succeeded in surrounding an American force in the town of Bastogne and ordered the American commander to surrender. The American commander famously replied with one word, nuts. And he was actually, in the end, fortunate that Patton's army was able to save him before they were annihilated. Of course, the Battle of the Bulge failed as 1944 ended. This concludes a section on 1944 from D-Day to the end of 1944.